Alright, welcome to The Breakdown. This is the first episode of this channel, so forgive me if it looks a little bit amateurish. I'm still figuring out what to do with the lights and the cameras and stuff. But nevertheless, I thought I'd talk about kind of the granddaddy of all conspiracy theories in this one, and just give a very brief and broad overview of some of the main points of this particular conspiracy theory, which you can see behind me is, of course, 9/11. So the first one that a lot of people look at as kind of a smoking gun is World Trade Center 7. This building's collapse really looks like a demolition. It's an extremely fishy collapse of a building. The other thing to look at is the Pentagon. The damage at the Pentagon site, as we'll be seeing in just a minute, is extremely suspicious. Then the third one, so on the morning of 9/11, you had the US military conducting the largest ever series of aerial war games simulating hijacked aircraft, hijacked passenger planes rather, more specifically, all across the United States, but specifically in the northeastern sector, which is of course where 9/11 occurred. And then the fourth thing, if we have time for it today, that's a weird looking for, the collapse of the Twin Towers themselves.
Hands and praying. As I stand on the Manhattan Bridge, which is closed, it is open to pedestrian traffic. Some people are working across, but there's just no way for them to. As I look at it, something is, I can't. It looks like that building is going. Is that the building going down? Is that the second building of the World Trade Center going down?
Yes, that is the second. That is the second tower. That is the second tower.
It's a huge plume of smoke that came out of the middle of the building, and then the building just disappeared into the smoke.
That is the second building that has gone down. It came out like a plume of smoke, like a banana unpeeling.
So, the collapse of WTC 7. All right, to begin this, I'd like to just show you a quick video, and it's just 1 or 2 minutes long, and it shows the collapse repeatedly of Building 7, so you can just take a look at it yourself, see if that looks a bit suspicious to you, and then we'll talk about it. So, here's that video.
This is an orange. If you were told it was something else, you wouldn't believe it, would you? This is called visual identification based on experience. This building is about to be destroyed in what is called a controlled demolition. Buildings do not do this spontaneously. Here is another example of a controlled demolition. The initial charges are spaced about 1 second apart, and you can see that each section begins falling separately. Successful demolitions require that all structural support columns collapse at virtually the same time. If they don't, or if something else goes wrong, the result will look something like this. This is World Trade Center 7 just before it collapsed on September the 11th, 2001. It had not been hit by an aircraft. It had been damaged by falling debris and fire. But by 5:20 p.m. most of the fires had been extinguished. Although the building was 47 stories high, it doesn't fall sideways, nor collapse unevenly. For this to have happened, all of the building's vertical supports must have given way at almost exactly the same time. Yet the Federal Emergency Management Agency reported that the collapse was due primarily to fire. But what does it look like to you? As at July 2007, there is no final report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology still rules out a controlled demolition. So the question is, do you believe what you can see with your own eyes? Or do you believe what you are told?
So, as you just saw there, pretty suspicious the way that Tower 7 fell. So let's just draw a couple things real fast. Let's say that this is WTC 7. The first thing to notice when it collapses is you'll notice that this is the roof right here. You'll notice that the roof kind of crimps in right here and right here before it starts to fall. So you can see on your screen right now sort of the very beginning of the collapse. So notice that crimping right there where you see right at the top where it crimps in on the right, crimps in on the left at the same time. It's almost as if you can see from the outside the internal support structures of the building, right, sort of lining up with those two crimps, losing all their integrity, and then the building just collapsing straight down as a result. You'll also notice in the video the way that, so if this is the tower again, it falls straight down perfectly symmetrically. And what I mean by that is if here's the roof, here's a big point right here, here's a point right there, right? So there's nothing that says that if a building is about to collapse because some of its support structures, let's say down here, are starting to give way, there's nothing to prevent it from, let's say, this point falling a bit first while this is still up here, and then this one either not falling at all, so therefore creating kind of a slanted, kind of crumbling where sort of half the building crumples down like this, whereas the other half remains standing. I mean, any number of different scenarios are possible. But what you see instead is this point and this point coming down at exactly the same time. You'll also notice that the building falls at free fall speed, meaning that if you were to take a marble and drop it from this height, and it would then hit the ground here, at the same point as the corner of this rooftop of this 47-story building would then fall and hit the ground at roughly the same time as the marble just falling through air with nothing in its path. It wouldn't fall at free fall speed as if there was nothing in its way. The only way it would fall that quickly is if you blew out all of the support structures within the building, and therefore nothing was in the way of the building as it collapsed all the way to the ground.
That's good shit. Then we went back there. Whoa, 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 whoa!
All right, so let's draw two quick things here. Let's go with, this is building 7 here. It's a smaller version of it. Dwarfing that, let's say, is the World Trade Center, just sort of going up off the board. The distance between the, one of the Twin Towers and building 7 was about a football field's length away. Only a fairly small amount of debris actually made it all the way to World Trade Center 7. It had very minimal damage to it, to the point where you can't even really see any damage in any of the photographs, right? But to be fair, like, let's say a modest amount of debris probably did kind of hit the building from the World Trade Center as it collapsed at an angle and hit probably somewhere around here, around a third of the way up the building, right? So there was at least a little bit of debris that did hit the building at this place right here. A few relatively small and tame fires did erupt at around a third of the way up the building. Let's just say these are fires. These fires were really not that intense, right? You can tell by the color of the flame, you can tell by how much smoke they're putting out, etc., that these were not overly intense fires. These were not raging infernos. A lot of people like to sort of cleverly put it that World Trade Center 7 was the third steel-framed building to collapse due to fire. The first two were the Twin Towers, okay? So that's a clever way of saying that no steel-framed building has ever fallen because of fires. That's just a fact. There have been numerous large skyscraper buildings in cities all over the world, especially as well as in the United States, that have had raging infernos. Half the building, all the floors of the building are just sort of spewing flame in this really spectacular fashion. It's very cinematic. Okay, so the point is we're talking massive raging infernos that would sort of go all the way up the building, and yet even in those cases, the building still didn't collapse. Yet World Trade Center 7, from a really, I want to emphasize that, modest amount of debris collapsing into some of the lower floors of the building, sparking a handful of fairly modest fires, that then caused this really large 47-story high building to then neatly collapse in this very unusual controlled demolition fashion, falling perfectly symmetrically at free fall speed to the ground in a neat little pile at its footprint. to collapse into its footprint is what they always talk about with a controlled demolition. That's the whole point. And they go through a lot of work. There's a lot of engineering involved, a lot of expertise involved to place the explosives just so at certain points in the building so that and then you also have to time the explosives so that they go off in an extremely sort of computer-controlled sequence that takes out key support columns within the building so that the building, instead of toppling over to the side or whatever else, instead of that, the building neatly collapses right into its footprint, which is exactly what Building 7 did. That was a controlled demolition if there ever was one. Now, the next important thing to talk about is the wreckage at the Pentagon. Now, this one is actually quite complex, so I'm only going to give a very broad strokes overview of what happened there and why it's so suspicious. Now, when you look at your screen right here, you'll see a picture of the Pentagon before the roof collapsed, and that gives a better idea of sort of the size of the hole in the outer wall of the Pentagon that was made by whatever hit the Pentagon, right? Let's say this is just sort of this wall of the Pentagon. And the photograph before the roof here collapses downward at an angle like this. Before it collapses down like that, you see a hole pretty much right on the first floor, so the first couple floors of the Pentagon, that's, yay big. The only damage that you see in the Pentagon in this photograph is just this single hole right here. All the sort of walls and windows and stuff that are going, there's like windows right here, etc. None of this is showing any damage. Now, what's interesting about that though is, of course, I think the dimensions of the craft that hit the Pentagon, this passenger jet, I think it was a Boeing 767. I might be wrong about that, but either way, large passenger jet. Let's just say that the height of the tail fin was like this, wide, and then let's say that this is the fuselage here, and then the length of the wingspan is, goes all the way out here. And yet, you can see that before the roof collapses, the only damage to the building is this hole that's like right there. So, if the plane crashed into the building, where's the damage from the wings hitting the building? Where's the damage from the tail fin hitting the building? Now, the official explanation is this. Let's say this is a top view of the airplane. This is the front, so let's just go with like this being like the cockpit. And then you have the wings. And then underneath each wing is this big, heavy engine, right? Okay. Now, what the official explanation is saying is that when the plane collided with the wall, right here, these wings then folded backwards like this and like this, so that this now could be sort of a nice narrow torpedo that would then go neatly into the hole in the building, which is only, yay big, and therefore doesn't sort of accommodate for the wings hitting the sides, which of course shows zero damage, right? Now, a lot of people have pointed out that that's not really how physics would work. First of all, if this plane then collided with this wall at really high speeds, and it would have been several hundred miles an hour, the force of momentum of the wings would cause the wings to move in this direction, right? Because as soon as this hits a wall, that creates a stopping motion on the plane that's going forward, and so therefore the wings would be inclined to move this way. There's no reason why upon impact with a solid concrete wall, the wings would suddenly flip backwards like this, right? They would instead be inclined to kind of break off right here and move forward with the momentum of the plane. So in this case, you would still expect these wings and of course the really big heavy engines underneath each wing to collide with the wall right around here. But you don't see that. Instead, you see something which really kind of defies physics, and that as soon as the plane hits the wall, the nose hits the wall, these then move backwards, fold backwards like this, which simply does not conform to physics. As soon as this nose hit the building and there was a stopping motion on this plane going hundreds of miles an hour, these two engines in particular probably would have broken off from the wings, and the wings themselves would have broken off as well, but their momentum would have been this way, right? And they would have collided with the building here, and yet in the photographs, there is no visible damage whatsoever to any of this section of the wall. So what hit the Pentagon? If this is an aerial view of the Pentagon, essentially what the Pentagon is it's built with several concentric rings. Each one of these, houses a row of offices, okay? And there's space in between each of these rings, okay? Now, the plane went through, now if I understand it, the plane, let's say it impacted right here, okay? Now, the damage goes all the way through each of the rings, I think all the way to the middle. I'm fairly certain, but I'll have to check on that. But either way, inside one of these inner rings, there's a nice, clean, maybe about 10 to 15 foot sized hole that sort of leads out into the inner courtyard here area, right? So it's an open air courtyard here. How did that hole get there? And the other thing is that essentially the official story says that the plane, because it hit at such a high speed and there was jet fuel, etc., essentially vaporized entirely upon impact, right? Which is why there's very little, if any, truly tangible physical evidence of there being a plane. There are a couple shots with really small debris, things that are basically handheld. And so if there's no wreckage, and I believe the black boxes, I guess, would have been incinerated in this vaporization as well, so there's no black boxes either to record what happened. If that's true, then what was it that exited this inner ring to leave this hole? So some projectile would have needed to exit through this hole to create it, but there's nothing there. There's no wreckage that anyone can see that created the hole, right? So if some projectile, some little torpedo went through to make this hole in the inner ring, where's the wreckage, right? Where's the thing that made that? Where's that piece of fuselage, for example, that would have made that hole and then now you can examine it? There's nothing. The other thing that's quite unusual is that the medical reports from coroners or whoever else that do the scientific examination of the site, they say that they've identified, I think, most if not all of the DNA of the victims. But how exactly is that possible when the heat from this impact and the resulting fires was so extreme as to vaporize a solid metal plane, but did not vaporize the blood or, that you would need to do a DNA analysis, right? And I believe the melting point, let's say the melting point of aluminum and steel and things like that, these are, roughly 1,000 degrees Celsius, whereas I believe the sort of destruction point of DNA is only maybe like 200 or 300 degrees, okay? So where did you get this DNA? How did you identify all these passengers using their DNA if the fires were so hot so as to melt all the metal of the plane, including the nearly indestructible black boxes? So that's the Pentagon. Let's move on to the next thing. Okay, so the collapse of the Twin Towers themselves, there's so much data on this one that it's really hard to know where to begin. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some of the suspicious things about the collapse of the Twin Towers. There will be multiple videos in the future dedicated to getting into the specifics on that, but for now, let's just go with a very, broad strokes overview. So let's say you have the Twin Towers here. Let's go with this as an airplane. I can't draw to save my life, so let's just go there. This is an airplane right here, this little Jetson mobile here. The official version is that the fires burned so hot so as to cause the sort of metal trusses within the buildings to give way, therefore causing the building to collapse downward, right? However, there's several serious problems with that. First of all, We talked a second ago about the melting point of metal, right? So these were steel framed buildings. Steel has a melting point of, I believe, a little over 1,500 degrees Celsius. Okay? That's the melting point of steel. And yet, the top temperature that jet fuel can reach is quite a bit lower than that. Here's a top-down view of the Twin Towers, right? A little cross-section, top-down view. So basically, this is the roof. The whole outer part right here, this is all steel. Just this huge grid of thick, very strong steel. Okay, this whole outer part. Then, in the center, is the steel core of the building, right? Now, this steel core is made up of these extremely large, thick box columns of extremely strong steel. This is the strongest part of the building, okay? This is what's really holding it up, right? So from this inner core, let's say you're looking at a floor, there would then be beams of steel going out like this, upon which the floor that you'd be standing on, if you were on like the 50th floor, is resting, okay? In order for us to have a pancake collapse, which is what the official version says, which is one floor crashing into the one below it, the force and momentum of that floor crashing into the one below it causes that one to then crash, and then the next one crashes, and the next one, i.e. the pancake-style collapse. One side note on that is that if it were in fact a pancake collapse, that means that the rate at which the building was collapsing would slowly decelerate as the building went down. But it didn't. Once again, if this is the Twin Tower, right here, just like with Building 7, they collapsed at free fall speed, with both towers collapsing between 8 and 10 seconds, which is exactly the amount of time it would take as if you dropped a marble at the very roof, and then it would fall all the way to the ground. It would take between 8 to 10 seconds for that marble to hit the ground. And the same thing is true with the Twin Towers. So if it was in fact a pancake collapse, it collapsing all the way to the ground would not be possible in the 8 to 10 seconds that we see on the video, right? That's another pretty big smoking gun right there. In order for the building to fall in the sort of straight down kind of symmetrical fashion that we see at free fall speed, never minding how that's impossible anyway, but at free fall speed, straight down, in order for that to happen, all these pieces of steel that comprise the core, the trusses that sort of go outward that hold up the floors, all the steel columns that sort of collectively make up this extremely strong grid of steel surrounding the entire outer building, the trusses holding up all of that steel would have had to give way simultaneously. It wouldn't be like this one would collapse and then the whole building collapses. No, in order for it to come down in that free fall speed straight down, you would essentially need all of these support trusses. If you remember my little crude diagram here with a column and a column, we got a little truss right there, little truss right there, piece of steel holding up the floor that you're standing on when you're in the office building. This thing then sort of sagging in the middle and therefore coming undone from these two trusses and then going down. All of these would have to essentially melt and sag and collapse off of their trusses at virtually the same time in order for the building to completely lose its structural integrity and start to come to the ground. But needless to say, the narrative of these beams sort of being heated enough to cause them to sag a little bit, to then fall off of the trusses and therefore initiate a sort of domino reaction and a pancake collapse of the towers, strains credulity, to put it very mildly, right? If it's not extremely implausible, it's possibly even impossible for that to happen. But that's the very quick overview of the Twin Towers. There's multiple other things that we could talk about, but I'm gonna leave those to future videos. Now, the last thing we're gonna talk about today, and again, quite briefly, is the war games that were being held on the morning of September 11th, simulating hijacked aircraft, specifically within the northeastern quadrant of the United States, which is, of course, where the attacks occurred in Washington, Pennsylvania, and New York. Now, one of the first things to mention about the war games is that many of the fighter aircraft that the United States has at various bases across the country to protect the country's airspace had been sent away from this region, leaving it fairly unprotected. Now, I believe there was one called Northern Vigilance, where, let's say this is Alaska up here. Many of them had been moved to, I believe, somewhere in this area up here. Now, the reason why, of course, is because Russia at this point in time was conducting a war game of its own in which it had, naval ships and aircraft operating somewhere up here, sort of in the Arctic, and these jets were there just as a presence to, serve as a buffer against the Russians, in case they wanted to invade. But there were also several other F-16s and other aircraft that were also, traditionally stationed at the Air Force bases in this region, but were sent to locations that were farther away, leaving a lot of this region pretty unprotected. Okay? Vigilant Guardian. Now, essentially what this does is that all throughout the country, but specifically in the Northeast Quadrant, air traffic controllers, whether it's with the FAA or with military personnel manning military radars throughout the sort of Northeast Quadrant, when they're looking at their radar screen, let's go with this being a radar screen right here, right? And you know how you have that little wave, that little thing that's sort of a little wedge-looking light that's kind of moving in a circle around it, right? When they're looking at their radar screen, part of this exercise is that it creates false blips, right? So like if you're looking at radar screen, there's going to be a whole bunch of little blips that look like a little triangle here, there, and everywhere. And these are blips that are supposed to be there, right? This is known passenger jets and cargo jets flying very specific routes. If they deviate from one of those routes, then that raises a lot of alarm bells, etc. But nevertheless, their screen will be covered in these little triangular blips showing aircraft moving along different sort of pre-prescribed paths all throughout, that region of airspace that the radar is covering, right? But part of the exercise, so for something like with Vigilant Guardian, is that it creates false blips, other little triangles that are not real aircraft. So, when the call comes in to these various air traffic controllers who are all playing this war game while also technically on real world duty as well, but while they're engaged in this war game, knowing full well that there's going to be all kinds of false blips on their screen, it creates confusion. They don't exactly know which ones are real and which ones are not. Now, when the call comes into them that, hey, we have a hijacked aircraft, right? So it's Flight 11 or whichever one is a hijacked aircraft, they don't know if this is real world or an exercise. And there's a lot of audio tape out there that says, where you hear these air traffic controllers saying exactly that. Is this real world or is this exercise?
All right, Boston Center, Team U. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
So to make the call to actually scramble the F-16s to get them up there, no one wants to look like an idiot and have the F-16 chase after a non-existent blip that's actually just part of an exercise. And so then when the F-16 pilot gets up there, he's like, what the heck are you idiots doing? You just sent me after nothing. This is a wild goose chase. There's no plane up here because it's an exercise and you're an idiot. No one wants to be that guy, right? So you create that confusion. The other thing that you do is that if you ever wanted to switch the aircraft, so for example, a trick that pilots could use if they're in sort of more of a military combat type situation where they want to fool the enemy's, radar screens, is that you take two planes, right? And if you merge the two, so if you have plane 1 and plane 2, right? If the two planes become close enough to each other, then they will appear as a single blip on the enemy's radar screen. So now, when the planes separate, two blips will now show up, but the radar operator doesn't know which blip is which plane. So imagine you have a situation where you have false blips on people's radar screens. They don't know if it's real world or exercise. They don't know should they actually scramble the F-16s or not. They got to get higher authority because nobody wants to make that mistake. And then also, if you wanted to switch out some planes, if you wanted to, let's say, switch out the passenger planes like Flight 11 or Flight 93 or whichever one, and you wanted to switch it out with, let's say, a drone-controlled aircraft, you know, so it would also be a Boeing 767, but instead it had no people on it and it was a drone. If you wanted to do that, you could have a false blip. The people would be like, oh, that's just a false blip. But then it would merge with, let's say, Flight 11 in the air and be just one single blip. And then when they separate, you don't know which one is now. Now you would have the drone still flying towards, let's say, the Pentagon or the World Trade Center towers, while the actual flight, 11 or 93 or whichever one, is diverted to another air base. But the point is that the air traffic controllers and the radar operators, with all this confusion going on, they don't know what's what. It goes without saying that the coincidence of having the largest ever series of war games on the morning of September 11th, that part of those war games at least was simulating hijacked airliners, hijacked passenger airliners, the coincidence of that, once again, that strains credulity, does it not? And of course, during the 9/11 Commission and other hearings, immediately after 9/11, this was brought up. Various Congress people would ask the different generals and admirals and stuff who were in charge, and they would say, like, did these war games either help or hinder our response times? And of course, the general standard line was that it actually improved, which is nonsensical. It did not increase response times. It dramatically reduced them. People say, oh gosh, the response times were so lackluster, I guess you would say, with the F-16s. But what they fail to realize is that due to the fact that there were these war games going on and these false blips on people's radar screens, the potential number of hijacked airplanes wasn't 4. It was something, I think it was like 27, right? So there were 27 different blips on their radar screen that were all potential hijackings, and they didn't know with any at least reasonable amount of confidence which one was the actual plane that was being hijacked versus which one was a non-existent simulated blip, right? So when you say that the response times of the F-16s was low, it's because they were freaking confused. They didn't know which one to go after. If you send the F-16 app to a certain location, it turns out, oh, there's no aircraft there. That was a false, blip on the radar. Well, now he's way out of position and he's never going to be able to turn around and get to the actual aircraft in time. And so they had to take those extra precious minutes to verify that, no, we're seeing this blip right here. This guy is Flight 11. This is the one that truly is being hijacked in real life. It took them those extra precious minutes to confirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was the guy. And that's what caused, that's at least part of the reason why it took the fighter aircraft longer than usual to get to position to protect the various sites, be it the Pentagon or the World Trade Center. Now, there's much more to that that I will get into in another video, but that's what I'm going to leave it there for now, because this is probably way longer than my average video. I think my average video is going to be like 10 minutes long. This one's going to be significantly longer than that, obviously. But the last thing I want to say, irrespective of the different bullet points of what's unusual about 9/11, is one thing to just think about for 2 seconds is, well, why do we care, right? Like, I mean, on one hand, it'll be like, well, obviously you should care because it's this huge terrorist attack and thousands of people lost their lives. And sure, that's definitely a reason to care. But there will be people, especially younger people, who weren't even born yet when 9/11 happened, and to them, it's ancient history. It was 20 years ago. And so life moves on. There's all these other problems confronting the country. There's other problems confronting them in their personal lives. 9/11 was 20 years ago. Why devote that much bandwidth towards, thinking about that problem? And I would just leave you with this one thought. if 9/11 was some form of conspiracy, people call it an inside job, a false flag. I don't know what the motivation of the conspirators were. I don't know what their end game is. Nobody does. If they say that they do, they're being less than truthful. They're just guessing. But if it was some kind of internal conspiracy, that changes everything, right? Because all the debates we have today, culture wars, left versus right, woke versus, whatever else the opposite of woke is. Point is, all of that stuff, Fox News versus CNN, that's sort of ripping the country down the middle, all of that stuff just goes up in a poof of smoke. It's completely meaningless. Because if we do in fact live in a world where there is some, cabal, for lack of a better word, that's capable of orchestrating something like these 9/11 attacks, capable of organizing and executing a conspiracy of this magnitude, then we do not live in the world that we think we live in. And the things that we're currently arguing about between, Republican versus Democrat just shrink to absolute insignificance in the face of the reality of living in a world where there is some sort of secret power that's able to, like I said, organize and execute a conspiracy of that magnitude in broad daylight and dramatically alter the trajectory of world affairs and people's lives. So, to leave you with that thought, if the conspiracy is in fact a conspiracy, then that changes everything. Everything. So, I will see you in the next video, and hopefully we'll get a little bit shorter and better. So, subscribe, hit the like button, all that stuff, and we will see you in the next one.